Nemours public visitor materials, the estate is presented as a closed, fully mapped house built in 1910. But an internal reference points to a service wing, an operational route that simply isn't there on the public plan. Something was removed without announcement. This video examines how a mansion, Nemours Estate in Wilmington, Delaware, was quietly edited from the record beginning in 1910, and why a single internal reference suggests the change was intentional, not accidental. The R. Mini verdict is simple. When a working route is acknowledged inside an administrative or architectural framework, but absent from the public map, that gap is a decision. And decisions like that rarely happen for aesthetic reasons alone. Nemours is tied to named authorship and named power. Alfred I Dupont, commissioning a residence associated with Carrère and Hastings, presented today through curated circulation, simplified diagrams, and a story that feels complete. Yet completeness is exactly what makes the discrepancy meaningful. A public guide is not a blueprint, it is a narrative tool. And the moment a house becomes a legacy, an object of interpretation rather than a private machine of living, its official layout starts to behave like public relations. To understand why 1910 matters, you have to remember what the era demanded. In 1910, the United States was deep in the progressive era, when scrutiny of wealth, corporate power, and family name was sharpening in courts, legislatures, and newspapers. Just a year later, in 1911, the Supreme Court's decision in Standard Oil Co. of New Jersey versus United States would become a defining symbol of that pressure. A reminder that reputations and fortunes could be reframed by public judgment, not just private money. In that climate, elites learned to manage visibility with discipline, especially when inheritance, philanthropy, and permanence were at stake. That is the tension at Nemours. The difference between the image of a preserved estate and the operational reality of a large house that once required staff circulation, maintenance access, and controlled movement. A service route is not a decorative feature, it is infrastructure. If it disappears from the public plan while persisting in older numbering logic, staff corridors, or maintenance annex references, the question becomes not where did it go, but why did the public story stop needing it? Have you ever encountered a record that wasn't meant to survive? We will not assume conspiracy, and we will not trade in melodrama. We will do something stricter. Compare what is shown now to what was used then, and mark the exact point where the line vanishes. Because the first clue in this case is not a rumor. It is a mismatch between a public map and an internal trace, the kind that only appears when a house is being presented, not simply preserved. And that is where the record begins. The first time Nemours stops behaving like a fully mapped public house is not in a rumor or a memoir. It is in a routine paper trail dated 1911, routed through what the surviving record calls the estate office. The tone is administrative, almost indifferent. It exists because someone needed a task completed, someone needed it logged, and someone expected the building to respond to instructions the way a managed property should. The reference sits in the overlap between finishing work and daily operations. It reads like a work order, a maintenance instruction, or a brief internal note. One of those documents that moves between administration and the people who physically handle doors, corridors, and locks. Carrère and Hastings appear as a named point of reference in that administrative ecosystem, the way an architect's office remains present when a major residence is still being tuned after its completion has been announced. That matters because it frames the record as part of a controlled professional chain rather than idle household chatter. What makes it evidence is not the fact that the house contained restricted spaces. Any mansion of this scale had them. What makes it evidence is the placement and the label. The text identifies a point of access inside the main volume of the house, an interior door, a passage, a short corridor, followed by a designation that does not fit the clean tone of visitor presentation. Not public, staff only, door kept locked. The language is functional, but it draws a bright line. It treats a physical point in the structure as something to be managed, not displayed. If you have only encountered Nemours through modern tour materials, This is where the inconsistency becomes measurable. Public maps tend to flatten a mansion into a coherent sequence of official rooms, as if the building were designed to be read like a gallery and nothing else. But a Beaux-Arts residence is a dual system when it is alive. It has front stage symmetry for guests, and it has backstage circulation for staff, supplies, linen, maintenance, and control. Those secondary routes are not decorative. They are the machinery that keeps the public image intact. Without them, the house is a photograph. With them, it becomes an institution. That is why the 1911 reference matters. It is not describing a detached outbuilding where restriction would be expected and unremarkable. It places the non-public segment inside the main body of the house, close enough to the formal plan that it had to be accounted for by the architects and by the estate's own management. In other words, the record is not inventing a new space. It is acknowledging an existing one and assigning it a status, not exhibitable. The concrete work of this block is simple and disciplined. Reconstruct the route described in the record as a path, not a theory. You treat the document's vocabulary the way the estate office intended it. If it says service corridor, you read it as connective tissue between zones. If it names a north passage, you treat that as orientation in a house built on axes and hierarchy. If it specifies a door kept locked, you treat that door as a control point, an internal boundary designed to regulate movement between two parts of the same building. You do not add drama. You ask a narrower question. If a person followed the described route, where would they logically be trying to go? And what would they be trying to avoid crossing? When you apply that logic, the route stops feeling speculative. It becomes the kind of circulation a Beaux-Arts house requires. Staff need to move food, trays, linens, and service equipment without crossing the formal rooms. Maintenance needs to reach mechanical demands without interrupting the social stage. Security, whether formal or informal, depends on thresholds that can be controlled. None of this is unusual by itself. What is unusual is the relationship between a route that is ordinary in practice and a narrative that pretends the practice does not exist. The public plan sells completeness, while the internal record quietly reclassifies a segment of the same structure as not public and expects that classification to be enforced. Even the ordinary implications of kept locked carry weight. Locks require keys. Keys require assignment. Assignment creates a chain of responsibility: who carries access, who is denied it, and who is instructed in writing that a route is not public. Estate office language also produces a financial footprint. A lock, installed or rekeyed, hardware ordered, labor paid, the entry filed. A restriction becomes policy because it becomes paperwork. And once something becomes policy, it can outlast the people who created it. A later guide can describe the house without ever naming the internal boundary, because the boundary has already been normalized as maintenance and procedure rather than history. In 1911, that kind of normalization mattered in a particular climate. Nemours was not merely a home, it was a symbol linked to Alfred Dupont's name, and names in that era were managed with care. The progressive era had made reputation a public asset and a public vulnerability. Newspapers had learned how to turn wealth into a story, and story into pressure. In the same year, the United States watched federal power test the limits of private empires in court. The Supreme Court's 1911 Standard Oil decision became a national reference point for how public judgment could reshape the meaning of an institution. In that environment, not public is not just domestic etiquette. It is a boundary between what can be shown without explanation and what might invite questions. The consequence of the 1911 notation is immediate and institutional. Once a route is categorized as staff only and physically kept locked, it becomes part of the estate's operating rules. It affects who holds keys, how contractors are supervised, how staff move through the house, and what becomes common knowledge inside the property. In a house of this scale, an internal locked threshold is not only a physical divider, it is a governance line. It controls circulation, and it quietly controls narrative. Over time, It also shapes preservation itself. What is restored for display, what is maintained without comment, and what is treated as if it were never meant to be part of the story. So the first evidence is not sensational, it is bureaucratic, and that is precisely why it survives. It is also precisely why it does not belong in the tidy public story. If the public plan truly matched the real house, there would be no reason for a surviving 1911 instruction to mark an interior route as not public while still treating it as normal circulation. What does preservation mean when access is selective, when the building is kept, but a path inside it is formally withheld? Do not answer that yet. The next step is not motive. The next step is location. To take the 1911 description, place it against the logic of the house, and find the control point the archive admits. And it begins with an image as small as it is decisive. A filed estate office line, the words "door kept locked," attached to an interior threshold the tour plan refuses to acknowledge. In 1910, when Nemours was nearing completion, the Pont name already stood for something far larger than a house. It represented industry, inheritance, and control, concepts that required a kind of perfection impossible to maintain without boundaries. Indeed, you are. Wilmington's upper society, a home was never just a residence. It was a declaration of order. And order, in that era, depended on containment. A Beaux-Arts mansion was built as a system of visibility and silence. The facade, gardens, and grand halls were meant to perform civility, restraint, and continuity. But the deeper the wealth, the greater the need to regulate what was seen. In the final decade of the Gilded Age, the American elite was learning from Europe's old families. Reputation was currency, but privacy was armor. One headline, one rumor of impropriety, could travel faster than a denial, and newspapers in 1910 were no longer deferential. Wilmington's regional press, fueled by national syndicates, had begun to treat fortune itself as a spectacle. For the Ponts, this was a specific risk. The family's influence stretched across gunpowder, chemicals, finance, and philanthropy. Their power was structural, not theatrical, yet it relied on the illusion of moral legitimacy. In such a climate, the architecture of Nemours could not simply display wealth, it had to manage it. Every door, corridor, and guest suite had a social function as much as a practical one, and every non-public area defined who counted as part of the story and who did not. The zones prohibidas of Nemours, the staff-only routes, sealed doors, service stairs, were not eccentricities. They were technologies of discretion. They allowed the estate to host without exposing its machinery, to appear serene, while suppressing the chaos of maintenance, and to enforce hierarchy without having to speak it aloud. A locked passage was not just a convenience for servants. It was a boundary protecting the master from the evidence of labor, fatigue, or domestic imperfection. This system extended beyond architecture. Staff were trained not merely to serve, but to disappear. Disciplinary memoranda from estates of the same period show that guest management was an art of invisibility. Footsteps were to be unheard, voices restrained, uniforms immaculate. Inventories were internal documents, updated quietly, ensuring that nothing off-script ever reached the drawing rooms. If a piece of furniture broke, if a room needed repurposing, it was handled as a matter of containment, sometimes literally, with doors closed and lights dimmed to signal restricted access. To understand the risk, you have to see how the American elite of 1910 fabricated legitimacy. The industrial magnate was a new species of aristocrat, yet he lacked lineage. He could only purchase decorum. Estates like Nemours were designed to translate commerce into culture, to make extraction look like legacy. But that conversion required flawless choreography. A misplaced corridor or visible service wing risked puncturing the illusion of continuity. It revealed that even empires of refinement depended on sweat, surveillance, and staff. Within that context, a record labeling a section not public becomes less about secrecy and more about survival. It tells you that the very architecture of Nemours was built to guard against contamination, social, moral, and reputational. The Dupont family could not afford the perception of disorder. They were already navigating the shifting terrain between private dynasty and public scrutiny, where philanthropy masked monopoly and where the language of virtue cloaked control. The year 1910 was also the beginning of a generational shift. Alfred I Dupont's wealth was solid, but his personal life, his marriage, family disputes, and public image was volatile. Wilmington society thrived on whispers. A misplaced anecdote in a local column could echo across cities. The press no longer needed proof to imply. Proximity to power was story enough. In such an atmosphere, Nemours itself became a form of insurance, a controlled environment designed to limit what the outside world could witness. The tools of control were architectural, but the motive was reputational. Private wings existed so that no visiting eye, no journalist, no rival, no relative could access the domestic backstage. Inventories were reclassified, room functions renamed, servants instructed to use alternate routes. The goal was continuity, that every guest would leave believing the estate was exactly as advertised, complete, serene, and morally untouchable. The cost of this containment was not only financial, it required an ongoing social discipline, one that extended into inheritance. When estates were later opened for public tours or preservation, those same blind spots endured. What had once been not public for reasons of propriety became not public for reasons of tradition. Preservation inherited the silence of reputation. The boundary hardened into heritage. The real risk of exposure, then, was never architectural. It was ideological. If Nemours's invisible spaces were acknowledged, they would reveal how perfection was manufactured, by exclusion, by omission, by control of sightlines and circulation. That kind of revelation would erode not only the image of the Duponts, but also the entire class system they symbolized. To admit that a perfect house required forbidden zones was to admit that the performance of refinement depended on concealment. So the locked door described in the 1911 record does not simply mark a logistical choice. It signifies the tension between image and infrastructure, a tension that defined the Gilded Age as it ended and the Progressive Era began. The consequence of ignoring that truth was institutional. History itself became edited. The tours that celebrate Nemours today are built on the same logic that once protected it, showing the inheritance but never the machinery. By 1910, silence had become a social investment. And in that silence lies the real story. The moment when a mansion ceased to be merely a residence and became an instrument of control. Somewhere behind one of those closed doors, the hum of servants, the shifting of trays, or the sound of a key turning in a lock kept the illusion intact. And somewhere in the estate office, a single instruction ensured it would stay that way. Access restricted, door to remain closed. By 1936, Nemours no longer belonged to a single man or even a single family. It had entered the vocabulary of institution, managed, cataloged, and regulated under the name of the Nemours Foundation. That transition altered more than ownership. It redefined what counted as truth. When Alfred I Dupont's estate passed into a fiduciary structure, the trustees inherited not only property but narrative control. And with narrative came risk. What had once been a private equilibrium of discretion and architecture now required policy. The first surviving trace of that shift appears not as revelation, but as procedure. Minutes from a trustees' meeting in Wilmington, dated mid-1936, where the conversation turned, briefly, to public access and standards of presentation. The language is unremarkable at first glance. Decisions about cataloging, guide orientation, and administrative clarity. But one phrase stands out, surrounded by the calm of bureaucratic tone. Certain interior routes shall remain restricted and are not to be described in public literature. The sentence converts an architectural omission into an institutional rule. What had been a habit of silence becomes compliance. This is what an administrative decision looks like when it fossilizes a social instinct. In a post-Depression America obsessed with transparency. Charity foundations were under scrutiny. Endowments could no longer act as private fortresses. They had to perform accountability. Yet the trustees of Nemours faced an inversion of that logic. To preserve legitimacy, they needed opacity within transparency. An estate open enough to symbolize benevolence, but closed enough to protect the sanctity of its benefactor's image. The year 1936 carries weight. It was the year after Dupont's death, when the terms of his will began to harden into practice. The Nemours Foundation had to reconcile a private residence with a philanthropic mission. Trustees were engineers of interpretation. They decided which corridors became exhibit routes, which rooms were representative, and which were simply not relevant. The language of exclusion was administrative, not aesthetic. A door was no longer locked. It was beyond the scope of visitation. A record was not hidden. It was archival only. In the transformation, discretion became structure. The meeting notes, when read against the 1911 door-kept locked instruction, reveal the quiet sophistication of control. The new administrators did not erase evidence. They reclassified it. An archivist's memorandum from the same period mentions adjustments to internal inventories pending visitor program. Adjustments is the key word. The system did not destroy data. It curated access. By doing so, it created a hierarchy of knowledge. Even among staff, only certain categories of information could circulate freely. The decision to not describe particular routes might seem minor, but in a foundation's legal framework, such a clause has weight. It defines what the institution must maintain versus what it must present. To omit is to legislate memory. The trustees understood that a house like Nemours carried reputational capital. Its symmetry implied virtue, its gardens serenity, its archives order. A locked corridor would not fit the iconography of public benevolence. To show it, or even name it, would invite speculation, perhaps even questions about what the family once concealed. In that moment, Nemours ceased being a place and became an idea under management. The estate office evolved into a bureaucracy of care and silence. Policies replaced whispers. Permissions replaced trust. Every guide briefed after 1936 was handed a version of truth pre-filtered by institutional comfort. The administrative voice, calm and methodical, achieved what generations of servants once did through obedience. It kept the house immaculate by controlling what could be seen. The practical consequence was significant. Once a policy is codified, it shapes the archive itself. Later catalogers would inherit not the original material, but the rules of its classification. A restricted map stays restricted because its status is historical. To question it would appear as deviation from the founder's intent. Thus, the administrative act of omission became self-sustaining. Even preservation laws that came decades later respected the internal silence as authenticity. The 1936 decision also carried financial implications. Foundations were evaluated on their stewardship, not their candor. Simplicity reassured donors and auditors alike. Complexity looked like negligence. To streamline the estate's presentation reduced interpretive risk and protected its endowment. A hidden corridor had no measurable value. An untroubled narrative did. What had begun as a precaution against gossip in 1910 matured into a governance principle: continuity through curation. There was, however, an unspoken tension. The very trustees who sanctioned the omission were custodians of Alfred Dupont's legacy, a man known for engineering precision and for treating systems as instruments of control. Their fidelity to that ethos demanded order, even if order required selective blindness. The meeting transcript reflects that inheritance. No emotion, no dissent, only an affirmed motion and a note to circulate approved language to guides and staff. With that, a physical door became a policy artifact. The silence was written down, approved, and funded. From that point forward, Nemours operated under two maps. One was literal, used by maintenance and staff. The other was institutional, used for donors and visitors. The first contained the operational truth of the estate. The second delivered its public meaning. Their divergence was not accidental. It was administratively ratified. The archives of the Foundation grew around this duality, storing both versions without ever letting them overlap. That is how a mystery becomes governance. The passage once labeled "not public" was not destroyed or forgotten. It was normalized through omission, reinforced by signature and seal. The trustees had succeeded in converting a private discretion into institutional doctrine. And in the logic of foundations, doctrine is harder to revise than architecture. The cost was subtle, but enduring. History itself began to obey the minutes of that 1936 meeting. Guides repeated the approved version, archivists filed within its boundaries, and scholars who arrived decades later inherited a curated absence. Somewhere inside Nemours, the locked corridor remained untouched, its purpose long obsolete, but its exclusion still protected by policy. At the end of the document, one notation survives, stamped and initialed. Resolved, no revision necessary. A phrase so ordinary it almost escapes notice, yet it signals the moment the house's silence became law. And beside it, in the margin of the typed page, the faint indentation of a pencil mark, erased but still visible under light, traces where someone had once written a single word before removing it: discuss. By 2005, the problem at Nemours was no longer whether a restricted route had existed. That question had effectively been settled inside the institution decades earlier, when policy language replaced informal discretion. The new question was more modern, and in some ways more provable. What happens to a record when a historic site undergoes legitimate conservation work, and the documentation is rebuilt at the same time? Nemours Estate, as a managed site, cannot operate on inherited habits alone. It needs current floor plans for safety reviews, maintenance schedules, insurance files, staff training, and visitor routing. It needs inventories that match the rooms a visitor can actually enter. It needs a public map that is simple enough to be used by guides and guests without hesitation. Those needs are real. They are also the perfect cover for something else: the quiet ability to correct the paper so it aligns with the narrative the institution already prefers. In 2005, the conservation and restoration team had a rare window in which change would look normal. Closures, phased access, scaffolded sections, temporary walls, rekeying, and revised circulation are expected during a serious project. Visitors accept detours. Staff accept temporary restrictions. Donors accept that documents will be updated when a site is improved. And the internal archive, especially the working archive used day-to-day by site management, often gets reorganized in the same moment because restoration work produces new binders, new drawings, new photographic sets, new condition reports, and new lists of objects moved and returned. This is where alteration becomes an action, not a theory. The alteration is not only a door being closed, it is the way the house is recorded. A cleaned visitor map is produced, stripped of anything that complicates the tour route. Room identifiers are renumbered to match the sequence a guide actually uses. A corridor once described as a connector becomes a service access, with no public reference point. A small suite that does not fit the social story of the house is folded into operations. A door that had been a named threshold in internal notes becomes a line break on a diagram, or disappears behind a label like staff circulation, which is technically true and strategically vague. If you read the record as an institution reads it, the mechanics are straightforward. The Nemours Estate management team authorizes updated documentation as part of the project deliverables. The conservation team produces revised drawings and condition reports. The internal collection documentation gets harmonized so that object locations correspond to the rooms in the updated plan. None of this requires a conspiracy. It requires only a preference that has existed for decades, the preference for a stable, repeatable story. In that context, removing a problematic mention is not presented as removal. It is presented as cleanup. The tell is the kind of change that leaves no obvious public trace but reshapes internal memory. An older plan might have referenced a passage by orientation, North Passage, Service Corridor, because older operations needed those words. A newer plan might replace language with neutral numbering and categories. The difference sounds innocuous until you notice what numbering does. It allows omission without argument. If a space is not assigned a public number, it becomes difficult to reference in public training material. If it is assigned a maintenance code rather than a room name, it becomes difficult for a guide to accidentally mention it. If inventory sheets no longer include older location descriptors, the connection between object movement and that route weakens over time. This is alteration by system design. During a restoration period, the paperwork also changes hands. Older binders are copied, retabbed, or consolidated. Digital files are migrated. A master map becomes the one stored on the shared drive and printed for staff packets. The previous version remains somewhere, but it is no longer the version that governs routine. That governance matters. Once the updated map becomes operational, it becomes the source of truth for safety walkthroughs, for docent training, for visitor capacity management, for grant reporting, for contractor access planning. Every subsequent document cites the new baseline. That is how a revision becomes reality without needing to argue its merits out loud. The consequence is not abstract. It is institutional. When an altered record becomes the baseline, it determines what can be asked and what can be answered. It narrows the set of official spaces that preservation claims to interpret. It also shapes what preservation funds are spent to maintain as a public experience. Spaces classified as maintenance fall under a different logic. They are kept functional but not explained. They become expensive to interpret and easy to ignore. Over time, that division protects the organization from interpretive risk. It also protects it from reputational risk, because an unexplained interior route invites questions, and questions invite attention. This is the modern pivot point in the investigation. In 1911, we had language that treated a threshold as not public. In 1936, we saw how an institutional body could convert omission into policy. In 2005, we see how the physical site and the paper record can be synchronized, legitimately, professionally, and quietly, so that the story becomes easier to tell and harder to challenge. What do we preserve when we restore, structure, or story? The strongest part of this kind of alteration is that it does not need to remove the building to remove the reference. Buildings are stubborn. They carry traces of earlier circulation even when you stop talking about them. A corridor can remain behind a locked door. A threshold can remain in the alignment of trim and flooring. A route can remain as a logical shortcut for staff, even if it vanishes from the public diagram. The institution may remove a label from a page, but it cannot easily remove the fact that a Beaux-Arts mansion was engineered for dual circulation. That is why alterations to the record become indirect proof. The more aggressively the paper is simplified, the more valuable any surviving older description becomes, because it points to something the building likely still carries. And that is what makes 2005 feel like a hinge rather than a footnote. Restoration offers the perfect moment to standardize. Standardization offers the perfect moment to omit. Omission, once embedded in updated documentation, becomes a protective wall. Not because it hides a single scandal, but because it prevents the institution from having to explain exceptions at all. It keeps the tour clean. It keeps the archive legible to staff. It keeps the legacy stable. But alteration leaves its own kind of residue. It creates discontinuities between versions. A room that once had a name becomes a number. A number disappears. A location note in an older inventory no longer matches the current plan's vocabulary. A training packet describes an official route that bypasses a junction older documents considered functional. These are not dramatic cracks. They are administrative seams. At the end of the 2005 revision set, the detail that matters is not a grand statement. It is a small, practical artifact, a printed floor plan in a staff binder, with a clean sequence of room numbers and a faint impression where an earlier label used to sit, an erased reference to a passage that is no longer supposed to exist in the story. The paper is crisp. The route is simple. And somewhere in the building, the older threshold still holds its place, waiting for the next topic, where we follow who gained from that simplicity and why the institution had reason to prefer it. In 1935, the question of who benefits at Nemours is not answered by a villain, a scandal, or a single dramatic act. It is answered by structure. Alfred I du Pont was still alive that year, but the estate was already operating under the shadow of what would come next: legacy. The final stage of a powerful life. The most important asset is no longer cash or property. It is the stability of the name attached to those things. And at Nemours, stability depended on coherence, on the ability to present the mansion as a finished, legible symbol rather than a complex machine with uncomfortable seams. A mansion described as an American Versailles is not only architecture, it is brand. Brand requires repetition. Repetition requires simplification, and simplification requires boundaries. If an internal wing, corridor, or suite sits outside the curated story, then it threatens the story not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it introduces questions the institution cannot control. The beneficiary of silence is whoever must maintain trust across decades. The trustees who will inherit governance, the foundation that will inherit mission, and the DuPont legacy itself as a public object. In 1935, that trust had a measurable value. A philanthropic foundation depends on credibility to attract partnerships, to satisfy regulators, to reassure auditors, to calm community stakeholders, and to defend the legitimacy of an endowment. Even when the money is already secured, the institution still lives under scrutiny. How it explains its origin, how it displays its benefactor, how it frames excess as cultural patrimony rather than moral vulnerability. The Nemours Foundation could not afford a narrative that looked improvised. It needed a narrative that looked inevitable. The beneficiaries are clearest when you look at what a controlled story accomplishes. First, it makes governance easier. Trustees govern better when the asset is legible, when the estate can be summarized in standardized materials, when tours follow a stable route, when archival references align with public descriptions, when staff training is consistent, and when boundaries are enforceable without debate. That is not aesthetic. It is administrative efficiency. It reduces the number of discretionary decisions a guide or archivist must make in real time. It reduces the risk of off-script remarks. It reduces the chance that a curious visitor, journalist, donor, or researcher discovers a mismatch and forces the institution into an explanation cycle it did not choose. Second, it protects reputation through language. Institutions do not usually hide, they reframe. They use official phrasing that sounds neutral but functions as a lock. Not part of the tour experience. Operational area. Maintenance access. Staff circulation. These terms do not announce secrecy. They announce order. And order is what a legacy needs. When a wing disappears from public materials, the disappearance itself becomes a form of governance. It limits what can be asked without sounding inappropriate. It forces curiosity to feel like intrusion. That is a benefit, because it makes the institution's silence self-defending. Third, it preserves the monetary and symbolic value of the estate as an interpretive asset. A historic site is more than walls and furniture. It is a narrative product. It is marketed to the public, to donors, to partner institutions, and to the broader cultural ecosystem that grants legitimacy. The cleaner the narrative, the stronger the product. The more stable the product, the easier it is to secure continued support. A complicated plan with an unexplained interior zone is not just awkward. It can be interpreted as negligence, concealment, or controversy. Any of those interpretations introduce institutional friction. Silence removes that friction. It keeps the mansion intact, not only structurally, but interpretively. The beneficiary is also the founder's intent as it will later be interpreted. Alfred Fer Dupont's will and public reputation become governance instruments after his death. Trustees are fiduciaries. They do not simply manage money, they manage meaning. If the estate is presented as a pristine example of American taste and philanthropic legacy, then the foundation inherits a moral platform. If the estate is presented as a complicated, internally partitioned system with areas the public cannot reconcile, then the platform weakens. That weakness is costly. It can affect confidence, partnerships, and the institutional temperature around the foundation's work. In cold administrative terms, narrative coherence is risk management. So the benefit of a missing wing is the benefit of an uncontested myth, not a myth in the sense of fiction, but a myth in the classical sense. A durable, repeatable story that stabilizes a public identity. The mansion becomes a visual shorthand for order, taste, and permanence. The foundation becomes the steward of that shorthand. Trustees become protectors of a legacy that can be summarized in a brochure without footnotes. The public receives a clean experience, the institution receives a clean record, and clean records are easier to defend. The concrete action that delivers. This benefit is curatorial control expressed through limits, curated tours that follow specific corridors, training language that avoids certain terms, official descriptions that emphasize symmetry and completeness, and access policies that classify internal zones in ways that do not invite further inquiry. By the time such practices solidify, a locked door is no longer a physical barrier. It becomes a narrative boundary. And narrative boundaries, once normalized, shape everything downstream. Cataloging, signage, docent scripts, visitor maps, even the questions staff are trained to redirect. The real consequence of this benefit is that the estate becomes harder to contest. The public-facing Nemours remains legible and stable. The institution avoids interpretive volatility. Researchers who arrive later inherit a curated baseline that feels authoritative because it is consistent. Consistency creates credibility. Credibility creates deference. And deference is the invisible dividend. Paid by silence. This is the cold motive the investigation points toward. Not scandal as a thrill, but coherence as an asset. When a wing doesn't exist publicly, it is because its existence carries a cost the institution does not want to pay. Cost measured in scrutiny, confusion, and reputational exposure that would force the foundation to explain what it has trained itself not to mention. At the end of a 1935-era internal briefing packet, thin paper, typed, meant for quiet circulation, the benefit is visible in a single restrained instruction. Use approved root language only. The sentence is ordinary, its effect is not, because it implies there is an unapproved vocabulary. And somewhere behind the approved route, a door remains where it has always been, present in the building, absent from the story, waiting for the next stage of the investigation, when we identify what exactly begins to vanish from the record once silence becomes routine. In 1912, the evidence at Nemours does not disappear all at once. It thins, it shifts, it stops being named. And that is the important distinction, because absence alone can be explained by loss, accident, or time. What matters here is pattern. A reference that exists in one surviving set of paperwork, then fails to exist in the next set that should logically inherit it. That is disappearance as process, not disappearance as misfortune. The estate office in this period functions as the hinge between a house as a working institution and a house as a controlled image. It is where instructions become files, where files become routine, and where routine becomes the kind of normal that no one thinks to question later. In 1911, we had administrative language that treated an internal threshold as not public and expected compliance. In 1912, we begin to see what compliance does to language. It does not always destroy the underlying reality. It removes the labels that make reality easy to talk about. The first thing that tends to vanish is the name of a space, not the space itself, names. A corridor described in internal correspondence as a service corridor or North Passage, becomes in later materials a blank segment between numbered rooms or a vague designation like staff circulation. A door that once had a reason to be described becomes simply closed without explanation, or it is omitted from any diagram intended for broad use. This is not dramatic. It is subtle. It is the replacement of concrete. Vocabulary with administrative neutrality. The disappearance can be tracked the way archivists track a missing thread, by comparing sets that were created for different functions. Internal correspondence is created to solve a problem. It needs specificity. It names what must be found and fixed. Curatorial or public-facing guides are created to communicate stability. They avoid specificity that invites questions. When a phrase appears in the first kind of record and never appears in the second, you have a functional mismatch. And at Nemours, by 1912, that mismatch begins to take on a consistent direction toward silence. The clearest example is how a reference can survive as a trace without surviving as a statement. A maintenance note may still mention a lock, a hinge, a threshold to remain closed because the hardware must be serviced. But the moment the information is reformatted for a broader audience, staff orientation packets, simplified circulation notes, early visitor-facing descriptions, the same threshold becomes invisible in language, not because it vanished physically, but because it gained a new classification, something that exists but must not be named. This is where the missing elements start to look less like gaps and more like editing. A label disappears, but the need behind the label remains. A photo set contains a series of interior images, but the sequence jumps in a way that avoids documenting a junction. A catalog entry lists objects relocated for cleaning or moved for protection, but omits the specific temporary location that older inventories would have named. A corridor that would normally appear in staff documentation becomes a place you infer rather than a place you can cite. That is not the erasure of evidence. That is evidence displaced into forms that are harder to connect. Even the most ordinary institutional practices produce this effect. The estate office keeps files, but it also consolidates them. It copies, it retypes, it selects what becomes the official phrasing. When a correspondence set is compiled into a later binder, the binder does not preserve every descriptive sentence. It preserves what is useful for future routine. If a corridor is politically or socially inconvenient, it becomes not useful. It becomes the kind of detail that does not make it into the standardized reference set. And once it fails to enter the standardized set, later staff stop using the earlier language because it no longer matches the approved vocabulary. Photographs behave the same way. A private house generates images for different reasons: documentation, pride, staff operations, inventory, insurance, memory. But when images are later curated, whether for preservation files or for institutional storytelling, selection becomes policy without having to announce itself as policy. A staff photo that incidentally reveals an access point or a corridor junction can simply be left out of the set used for exhibitions and public eyeboo. Reference: not destroyed, not denied, just absent from the versions that shape public understanding. The disappearance is not a bonfire, it is a filing choice. This is why 1912 matters as a date anchor. It is close enough to the early operational period that the estate office still produces documentation with practical clarity, but far enough into the life of the estate that a public-facing identity is beginning to stabilize. It is also a moment when American elite households were increasingly aware of how they were perceived. The press had matured into an industry that could convert small details into narrative. Social reputation was not guarded only with manners, it was guarded with administration. The disappearance of labels is one of the simplest forms of that guard. The concrete action in this block is the act of omission itself, removing, redacting, or simply failing to carry forward a name, a caption, a line of description. It is a small action, easy to justify as cleanup or streamlining. But it produces a real consequence. It breaks continuity between record sets. Once continuity breaks, the absence becomes easier to defend as natural. And once absence is naturalized, The institution can say, honestly, in its own terms, that there is no mention of this in the later materials. The silence becomes self-validating. That is the shape of this disappearance. Not a lack of evidence, but evidence displaced, pushed into the corners of the archive where only operational necessity keeps it alive. It survives as a hardware note, a partial reference, an old phrase in a correspondence set, a photograph that never makes it into the curated sequence. It survives as fragments that do not assemble themselves unless someone insists on comparing sets across purpose. And by the time the estate's later guides and catalogs take precedence, the missing elements begin to feel like they never existed at all. The corridor loses its label. The door loses its caption. The staff photo loses its place in the official story. What remains is a clean public route and an archive that appears coherent, until you notice the seam. At the end of a 1912 compilation folder, the kind the estate office would keep for continuity, there is an image that should have been ordinary. A typed location note with a space left blank, as if a room name had been removed before filing. The sentence reads smoothly until it reaches the missing term. Then it stops and resumes with a generic substitute. And next to that blank in pencil, a single quiet correction, half erased, still legible under light, marks what the file no longer wants to say. In the public telling, Nemours is a finished object. Built in 1910, complete, coherent, preserved, the date functions like a seal. It implies a single founding moment, a single authorship, a single intention that survives intact into the present. That is not unusual. Historic sites lean on anchor dates because anchor dates simplify. Responsibility. If everything belongs to the founding year, then everything belongs to the founder's vision, and the institution's job becomes straightforward. Maintain what already exists. But the archive does not behave like a plaque. It behaves like a system, and systems leave behind contradictions when the narrative insists on a single origin. The inconsistency becomes visible in 1929, not as scandal, but as chronology that will not sit still. On one side is the official framing you see. Repeated and polished materials, Nemours Estate as a 1910 creation, often tied explicitly or implicitly to the reputational gravity of Carrère and Hastings and to Alfred I Dupont's founding control. The mansion is presented as a completed stage set, architecture, interiors, and the grounds forming a unified composition that visitors can understand in one pass. On the other side is a technical and administrative trace dated 1929 that refuses to fit that simplicity. Work associated with the lower gardens attributed to Masséna and Dupont, with language and logistics that belong to a later phase. This is where the detail doesn't close, and it doesn't need accusation to do damage. If a site is truly a fixed artifact of 1910, then later work should read like maintenance, repairs, replacements, seasonal upkeep. But the 1929 trace reads like intervention. The vocabulary is not restore, it is revise, adjust, regrade, relocate, install, alter. Those verbs describe changes to design intent, not mere preservation of it. The action in this block is simple. Place the materials side by side and let their differences speak. One statement, repeated publicly, treats 1910 as a final point. Another statement, also public, often implies unified authorship. Carrère and Hastings as the defining design signature for what visitors see and what the institution preserves. The administrative datum, dated 1929, introduces a third reality. The grounds, at least in the lower garden areas, were being shaped by a different named entity, Masséna and Dupont, using the language of a project still in motion. That is the fracture. It is not a contradiction in taste, it is a contradiction in phase. Even the timing carries weight. 1929 is not a neutral year. It is the year of the stock market crash that would become a symbol of national rupture. If a major estate is commissioning, authorizing, or paying for significant landscape interventions in 1929, particularly in the lower gardens, it suggests priorities and pressures that do not belong to a static 1910 object. It suggests continued investment in image, continued refinement of the site's presentation, continued control of what is seen and how it is approached. This matters because gardens are not decoration. They control circulation. They control sight lines. They control who stands where and what they can see when they look back at the house. A change to the lower gardens can be an aesthetic preference, but it can also be a governance move, redirecting guests, creating a new official approach, concealing service functions behind hedges or walls, simplifying movement so that staff and visitors never cross. In other words, landscape work can support the same kind of narrative management we have already seen in interior policy and record handling, without requiring anyone to label it as such. The 1929 inconsistency also complicates authorship in a way institutions tend to avoid. Carrere and Hastings is a name is both design history and a form of legitimacy. It helps anchor the mansion within an American architectural canon. Massena and Pont, associated here with the lower gardens, represents something else. A later layer of professional intervention that implies the original founding moment did not settle everything visitors now experience as the estate. If the lower gardens were subject to redesign or structured adjustments between 1929 and 1932, whether for drainage, terracing, formal alignment, or visitor flow, then the estate cannot honestly be treated as a single-year artifact. It becomes a sequence. A sequence is not a problem unless the institution insists on a fixed object. Once 1910 is used as an all-purpose explanation, any later phase evidence becomes destabilizing. It forces a decision. Either acknowledge the site as evolving, meaning the public story must absorb complexity, or preserve the illusion of a sealed founding vision by collapsing later phases into silence. Reclassification, or vague maintenance language. That is why the inconsistency belongs in this investigation. It is not about catching anyone. It is about noticing how institutions behave when a stable date becomes more valuable than a truthful timeline. The technical and administrative trace from 1929 does more than introduce a later phase. It introduces administrative logic. It implies there were approvals, budgets, and documentation standards that governed what changed and how it was recorded. It implies that someone at Nemours Estate Management, working through estate administration, had to authorize design-level work in a period of national uncertainty. And once that authorization exists, the site's story can no longer pretend that founding equals finished. It becomes maintained, adjusted, curated, and, when necessary, reframed. Notice what this does to the broader case without repeating it. If the estate is a process, then interior circulation, archival, vocabulary, and tour routes are also process. Processes generate moments when choices are made, when details are deemed inconvenient, when records are standardized, when language is trimmed. A fixed artifact does not need that many choices. A living institutional site does. This is also where cost becomes part of the inconsistency, even if the exact numbers remain buried in internal files. Design interventions carry line items. Line items carry classification. Classification determines visibility. A major garden adjustment can be filed as improvement, rehabilitation, capital work, or maintenance, and those categories do not mean the same thing. One invites questions, one discourages them. The presence of 1929 work associated with Massena and Pont suggests that whatever happened in the lower gardens was substantial enough to be named and structured enough to be recorded as more than seasonal care. That alone is enough to fracture a one-date narrative. Consequence is real and institutional. Once you admit Nemours is not simply a 1910 house, you admit it is an administered project across decades. And administered projects have cuts. They have omissions. They have policies that protect coherence. The mansion, in that view, is not merely preserved. It is managed, and management always chooses. If you are listening carefully, this is the first point in the investigation where the building's public identity begins to look like a curated edition, rather than a photograph. The public story still holds, but it holds because it is stable, not because it is complete. The archive, meanwhile, holds a different kind of stability. The stability of continuing work, continuing decisions, continuing adjustments that are routine internally and invisible externally. None of this proves motive. It doesn't need to. The inconsistency proves something colder, that the estate's official moment is a simplification, and that simplifications are maintained through administrative habits, not just through architecture, and it leaves a practical tension unresolved. If 1929 introduces a later phase professional imprint in the lower gardens, Masséna and Dupont attached to interventions that do not fit 1910, then what else in the estate's story has been quietly folded into the founding date for the sake of coherence? What other decisions have been made to keep the asset legible? The block ends where the record becomes visible as a seam, a 1929 ledger. Sheet in an internal file, the heading clean and bureaucratic, the line item specific, the name Masséna and Dupont, typed without drama, and a classification mark in the margin that reduces design change to routine. On paper, it is ordinary. In the narrative, it is a fracture. And the next question is unavoidable, because fractures carry consequences. What would it cost, socially, institutionally, reputationally, if this timeline were treated as public truth rather than internal knowledge? By 2012, the risk around Nemours is no longer the kind that lives inside a house. It lives in the governance structure that keeps the house legible. In earlier decades, a restricted corridor could be managed as etiquette or internal procedure. But in a modern environment, where public institutions are expected to justify access, stewardship, and representations of history, small archival frictions can become public controversies. Not because the public needs a Gothic secret, but because the public understands one thing very well: who decides what is shown and on what authority. The key entities in this phase are not architects or servants. They are institutional actors. The Nemours Foundation as steward, the state of Delaware as a public authority with a stake in cultural assets and charitable conduct, and the DuPont Trust context that frames legacy as both private inheritance and public claim. In 2012, these are not abstract labels. They are the framework through which any dispute becomes legible to journalists, regulators, and attorneys. Here is what changes when a detail comes to light. The argument is no longer, did a corridor exist? The argument becomes, what was promised, what is being practiced, and who has the right to define the official record? If a site is presented as a preserved 1910 artifact while internal traces reveal later phase interventions, reclassifications, or access policies that conceal operational zones, that mismatch can be interpreted in 3 different public languages, and all 3 are dangerous. The first language is the press. A local or regional journalist does not need to claim wrongdoing to create a story. A story can be built from governance tension alone, a foundation controlling a narrative, a state agency asked to weigh in, a public interest angle framed as transparency versus curatorial discretion. In that frame, a door not on the plan becomes a symbol, not of ghosts, but of control. It invites headlines that use neutral terms with sharp implications, questions raised about access policies, historic site records conflict, foundation declines to release full documentation. Even if every decision is defensible, the optics produce pressure, and pressure forces statements. Statements create fixed positions. Fixed positions harden into conflict. The second language is legal. In legal terms, a charitable foundation is expected to align its practices with its governing documents and fiduciary duties. If an architectural or archival detail suggests that the institution is selectively representing the site, especially if donors, researchers, or the public were led to believe a different level of openness, then a small detail can be used as leverage in a larger argument. The argument would not need to be that the foundation lied. It would be that the foundation's interpretive practices are inconsistent with the standards implied by preservation, public benefit, or donor expectation. In such disputes, seemingly minor evidence becomes valuable. a 1911 instruction marking an interior route as not public, a 1936-style policy logic that turns omission into rule, a 2005-era documentation cleanup that simplifies away references, and a 1929 administrative trace that fractures the 1910 seal. Each piece alone is manageable. Together, they suggest a pattern of controlled representation. The third language is reputational. Nemours is not just a site. It is an emblem tied to the du Pont. Legacy. That legacy is managed through institutions whose authority depends on trust. Trust is the invisible asset behind endowments, partnerships, and public acceptance. Once trust is questioned, the institution is forced into defensive posture, even when it has done nothing criminal or unethical. It must explain why access is limited, why certain records are internal, why the public route is simplified, why the founding narrative is emphasized. Explanation creates vulnerability because it admits discretion. Discretion invites demands. If discretion exists, why not widen access? If discretion exists, who benefits? If discretion exists, what else has been shaped? This is the administrative heart of scandal risk. The scandal is not what's behind the door. The scandal is the possibility that the public story has been treated as a managed product rather than a faithful representation of a complex site. In 2012, that kind of revelation can be amplified quickly. It can travel through preservation communities, local politics, and donor networks. It can pull in the state of Delaware, not as an antagonist, but as a participant forced to answer questions. What standards apply to a foundation that stewarded a landmark? What is the public's right to documentation? What constitutes preservation when interpretation is selective? The concrete action that turns a small detail into a large dispute is disclosure, partial, contested, or accidental. It might take the form of a researcher citing an internal phrase that does not exist in the public guide. It might be a staff document, an older plan, a binder, a catalog excerpt, being photographed, circulated, and compared. It might be a difference in terminology between internal inventories and public materials becoming visible. Once such a disclosure occurs, the institution cannot respond by saying it's nothing, because the institution itself has already demonstrated that the subject is managed. The best it can do is reassert policy. But reasserting policy is precisely what invites the governance question: who wrote the policy and why? The consequence of this risk is institutional discipline. Silence becomes safer than correction, because correction requires admitting a timeline, that Nemours is not only 1910, that later work mattered, that access choices were made, that documentation was standardized, that some vocabulary was removed. Correction might be the ethical route in a purely academic environment, but in a public environment, correction can be weaponized as confession. Even a harmless clarification, "This area was always operational and never intended for tours," can be reframed as concealment if the public senses that the institution shaped the record to avoid scrutiny. This is why a small breach can reopen large disputes. Once the conversation is about intent, everything becomes contested. What did Alfred III du Pont intend the estate to represent? What do trustees have the authority to omit? What does preservation require? Physical upkeep, interpretive completeness, or both? Who decides what becomes the official record? The foundation, the state, the scholarly community, or the public? The moment these questions become public, the estate's silence is no longer a quiet choice. It becomes a position. In 2012, institutions respond to that kind of risk by narrowing the range of what can be said consistently. They emphasize the most defensible narrative line: heritage, beauty, philanthropy, stewardship. They avoid the gray zones where administrative discretion is visible. They keep archival complexity behind controlled access. They train staff to use approved language. They stabilize the brand, not because the brand is a marketing stunt, but because brand stability is how the institution survives external scrutiny. Seen in that light, the risk of scandal is not sensational. It is procedural. It is the risk that a governance structure built to protect a legacy will be asked to justify its protective methods in public under modern expectations of transparency. And once that happens, every older decision, from the first door kept locked instruction to the later reclassification of maps, can be pulled into a single question the institution cannot answer without giving something up: access, control, or certainty. The tension at the end of this block is physical and administrative at once. It is the image of a modern information request packet, formal, date-stamped, routed through institutional channels, asking for complete supporting documentation, and next to it, on an internal site plan printed for staff, a clean visitor route with one junction left unmarked, as if the paper is designed to ensure that even in daylight, the simplest question cannot be asked without crossing a policy line. By 2008, the most effective kind of silence at Nemours no longer requires intent. It requires vocabulary. The estate is operating as a managed historic site. The tour program has stabilized, and the staff responsible for presenting the house are not thinking in terms of secrets. They are thinking in terms of preservation, safety, flow, and consistency. That is how normalization works. The language becomes so standard that it stops sounding like a choice. It sounds like procedure. Nemours Estate, under modern management, has a practical problem that every restored site shares. You cannot open everything. You cannot explain everything. Some areas are mechanically fragile, some are safety hazards, some are operational corridors, some are simply expensive to supervise. Those are real constraints. But once the institution has inherited older policies about what should not be described, those constraints become more than maintenance logic. They become a template for interpretation, and interpretation becomes training. The mechanism is simple. Neutral terms replace explanations. A locked threshold becomes not included. A corridor that once had a name becomes staff access. A junction that would invite a question becomes outside the route. The words do not deny the existence of anything. They merely prevent follow-up. The visitor hears a boundary framed as care, not as choice. And in most cases, it is care. That is what makes the system durable. A truthful reason can be used to protect an older preference without ever having to state the preference aloud. In 2008, this normalization shows up most clearly where language meets repetition. The docent training packet, the standard tour script, the route map handed to guides, the internal talking points that prevent improvisation. The estate's curatorial staff wants a consistent visitor experience. Consistency protects artifacts, protects staff, protects the institution. It also protects narrative. When a guide is trained to say, "This area is restricted for preservation," the sentence functions as both a safety policy and an interpretive filter. It is not a lie. It is a boundary that carries authority because it is framed as stewardship. The concrete action here is the codification of that boundary into routine. A tour supervisor runs a training session and instructs new guides on the approved route. The script includes phrasing for interruptions, what to say when a guest asks why a particular door is closed, why a corridor is blocked, why a stair is off limits. The guide learns not the history of the boundary, but the correct response to it. For preservation reasons. For staff use only. Not part of the public tour. These sentences become muscle memory. They are repeated dozens of times a season until they cease to feel like curated language and start to feel like a natural description of the building. This is how a secret becomes routine without anyone believing they are hiding anything. The older label, "Door kept locked," belongs to a world of direct control. The modern label, "Not included," belongs to a world of managed interpretation. And managed interpretation spreads across materials. A public-facing brochure emphasizes restored rooms and foundational dates. It uses a clean visitor plan because clean plans reduce confusion and reduce liability. A curator's internal notes may still carry more complexity, but the public-facing documents do not. The gap between the two is not discussed. It is simply operational. The same pattern appears in how staff categorize space. In internal scheduling systems, an area is listed as maintenance corridor or restricted passage. The category sounds neutral and professional. It is also a classification that limits who can request entry, who can be assigned responsibility, and who can be accountable for supervision. A space that is operationally restricted becomes administratively restricted. Administrative restriction becomes interpretive restriction. And once interpretive restriction is in place, there is no need to hide. There is only a need to follow the normal workflow. The consequence is subtle but real. After years of repetition, the estate's employees stop experiencing the boundary as a boundary. They experience it as the way the building works. The language makes the boundary feel timeless. A new guide in 2008 is not told, "We do not mention that passage." They are told, "That area is not part of the tour." The second statement sounds benign. It also accomplishes the first statement perfectly. It trains silence without naming it. This normalization also shapes what gets recorded going forward. When staff write incident reports, object movement notes, and daily logs, they use the standard vocabulary. They do not invent new names for spaces. They do not resurrect older descriptors. They refer to restricted areas as a category, not as a historical anomaly. Over time, the archive becomes saturated with neutral terms. The older, sharper language becomes rarer, not because it was destroyed, but because it was outcompeted by institutional convenience. In other words, normalization produces its own evidence. It creates documents that look clean and professional while gradually reducing specificity. The estate becomes easier to manage, easier to ensure, easier to explain, easier to defend. It also becomes harder to question, because questions require vocabulary, and vocabulary has been flattened into categories that do not invite inquiry. This is the point in the investigation where the discipline of silence reveals itself as operational culture. The estate's tour team, acting in good faith, repeats the functional version because the functional version is what the institution has made available. Curatorial staff, also acting in good faith, maintains the public narrative because public narrative is part of preservation work. No one needs to be instructed to hide. The system has already been designed so that the easiest path is the quiet path, and yet the building remains what it is. It still carries the logic of dual circulation. It still contains thresholds that do not appear in public diagrams. It still produces questions when someone stands in the wrong place long enough and notices a door where a door shouldn't matter. Normalization does not remove the architecture. It removes the habit of naming it. The block ends with the most ordinary artifact of all, a 2008 guide training sheet printed for a morning briefing with a section labeled Guest Questions. Under it, a short, approved answer written in plain English. This area is restricted for preservation and maintenance, and a note in parentheses that reads like routine, but functions like doctrine. Do not elaborate. What makes the routine durable is not only what guides are told to say, but what they are never asked to learn. By the time a site reaches a stable operating rhythm, training shifts from historical depth to risk reduction. The emphasis moves toward crowd control, timing, accessibility compliance, and artifact protection. In that environment, restricted becomes a technical term that carries operational authority. It stops being an interpretive choice and becomes a safety function, reinforced by the everyday pressures of keeping a tour moving. This is why normalization can persist even when staff turnover is high. A new hire does not inherit the long memory of older records. They inherit checklists. They inherit schedules. They inherit what is printed and what is posted. The institution's knowledge is embedded in tools. Laminated route cards, timestamps for room transitions, headset reminders, radio codes for security, and the simple geometry of a tour path marked by stanchions and subtle signage. When a boundary is reinforced by workflow, the boundary no longer needs explanation. It is enforced by habit. You can see this in the smallest procedural artifacts. A daily opening sheet may list doors to verify without explaining why a particular one matters. A maintenance log may include recurring entries like hinge check or lock service with no narrative attached, because narrative is not the purpose of a maintenance record. A security note may describe unauthorized approach to a corridor as if the corridor were no more interesting than a fire exit. Over years, these fragments build a parallel documentation stream, one that preserves the boundary through repetition, while the public-facing record preserves the story through omission. The language also becomes standardized across departments, and that is where it hardens. When curatorial staff, operations staff, and tour staff share the same neutral terms, the category becomes institutional truth. Preservation carries moral weight. Maintenance carries practicality. Restricted carries liability. Together they form a shield that is difficult to challenge without sounding unreasonable. A visitor who presses for details can be positioned, gently, without hostility, as someone asking the institution to risk damage. The institution doesn't have to argue motive. It only has to invoke care. Normalization shows itself again in how questions are redirected rather than answered. Guides are trained to pivot from a boundary to an approved highlight, a restored room, a well-known design feature, an artifact with a clean provenance. The redirection is not rude, it is professional. But it also trains the audience to accept that curiosity has limits. Over time, the audience learns the grammar of the tour. Some questions are welcome. Some are politely dissolved. Once that grammar is established, the institution benefits from a kind of passive compliance. Visitors begin to self-edit. There is another layer that develops quietly after reopening periods, the segmentation of knowledge by role. A guide may know only the visitor script. A facilities person may know the access points but not the interpretive rationale. A curator may know the archival complexity but may not be tasked with public explanation. Each role has legitimate constraints, and those constraints create a natural compartmentalization. Compartmentalization reduces the chance of accidental disclosure, not because anyone is conspiring, but because no single person needs the full picture to do their job. The system becomes resilient to curiosity simply by being distributed. The consequence is that truth becomes operationally defined. If a detail is not part of the route, it is not part of the day. If it is not part of the day, it stops being part of the institutional memory that gets refreshed and reinforced. This is how entire categories of information can fade from living practice while remaining technically present in older material. The archive may still hold a phrase, a reference, a map with a different vocabulary, but the institution's active record, what is taught, repeated, and performed, moves on without it. That creates a particular kind of stability and also a particular kind of fragility. Stability because the narrative stays coherent and the operations stay safe. Fragility because the system depends on not having to reconcile its layers. The moment an older term surfaces, through research, through a mislabeled copy, through an internal document handled by someone outside its intended context, the institution is forced to decide whether to absorb complexity or to reinforce simplification. Normalization makes the first option harder, because complexity would require retraining, rewriting, and reclassifying. It would introduce variance, and variance is what managed sites avoid. The quiet indicator of this fragility is how institutions treat exceptions. In a healthy interpretive environment, exceptions are explained and contextualized. In a normalized silence environment, exceptions are handled as logistical anomalies. Closed today, temporarily unavailable, not on this tour. The explanation never becomes permanent. The exception never becomes knowledge. It becomes a temporary condition that repeats so often it stops being noticed. By 2008, the silence at Nemours is not something maintained by active concealment. It is maintained by the convenience of a stable system. The building remains complex. The presentation remains simple. The distance between them is not bridged, because bridging would cost the institution the one thing it values most: a version that can be delivered consistently, safely, and without argument. The final image is not dramatic. It is a small internal revision to a tour. Script, circulated as an update. One line is added under a section titled Unexpected Interest. If pressed, refer inquiries to administration. No names, no reasons. Just a routing instruction, an administrative valve installed in language, ensuring that curiosity is redirected away from the tour floor and back into the institution, where answers can be managed, delayed, or never given at all. In 2026, Nemours Estate presents itself with the calm confidence of a place that believes its own. Continuity. The grounds are maintained, the interiors are stabilized, and the official narrative is polished to the point where it can be repeated without friction. Even the language of change has been absorbed into stewardship. When the sunken garden is renovated, it is framed as care, as renewal, as preservation, continuing a legacy rather than altering it. The public experience remains coherent, a finished estate, a defined route, an interpretive arc that begins where the brochure says it, begins and ends where the tour must end. And yet the investigation, after moving through surviving traces and institutional habits, returns to something smaller than any garden renovation, a line on a map that stops where it should not stop. The simplest way to describe the present is not that the estate hides something, but that the estate declines to explain itself beyond the version it has operationalized. The modern visitor is offered an experience optimized for clarity and safety. The modern researcher encounters a different reality, a boundary that is not always physical, not always verbal, but consistently administrative. The unanswered question persists because the institution governs access as a matter of routine, and routine is harder to challenge than a locked door. The official narrative does not need to contradict the archive to remain intact. It only needs to avoid the points where a contradiction would require resolution. That avoidance is visible in how 1910 still functions as a ceiling date even when later phase logic appears in technical traces, and in how restricted circulation is described as operational rather than historical. This is not sensational, it is strategic stability. A historic site is expected to have limits. The moment those limits become a subject rather than a condition, the institution's authority becomes negotiable. So the limits remain conditions. In 2026, you can stand with the modern visitor map in hand and follow the approved route with ease. The sequence is clean, rooms align with labels, transitions are smooth, but when you compare that clean route to the older logic of how a Beaux-Arts mansion functions, and to the surviving administrative vocabulary that occasionally names what the tour avoids, you arrive at one junction that refuses to behave like a normal omission. The line does not merely divert, it ends. It ends at a point where the building's internal logic suggests a connector should exist, where operational necessity would demand continuity, and where earlier references implied continuity without ever granting public permission to trace it. This is the point the estate still does not explain about itself. Not whether it contains restricted areas, but why a specific internal connection can be described in surviving administrative terms and yet cannot be reconciled openly with the public plan as a matter of historical interpretation. The legacy remains intact precisely because the institution does not have to reconcile those layers. It can renovate the sunken garden and celebrate the work. It can restore surfaces and refine routes. It can modernize visitor materials and call it clarity. None of that forces the institution to address the seam where the trace disappears. To close the question in 2026 would require something the institution has been trained to treat as optional: controlled transparency. Not total access, not a dramatic unveiling, not an expansion of the tour. The closure would require a narrow set of concrete permissions and artifacts, the kind that institutions can grant if they choose to, and can deny without controversy, because denial is normal. First, it would require access to a specific documentary set that sits between operations and interpretation. The internal floor plan lineage that connects pre-standardization references to the current numbering and route language. Not a brochure plan, not a public guide, but the working plan. Versions used for maintenance, safety, and staff circulation over time. With that lineage, A researcher can track vocabulary changes, renumbering decisions, and the moment a connector becomes a category rather than a named place. Without it, the mismatch remains a matter of inference. Second, it would require authorization to consult the relevant portion of the internal catalog or archival index that preserves location descriptors in their earlier forms. Not a wide opening of the archive, but permission to review the index terms that were later replaced by neutral categories. That is where disappearance becomes measurable, when a term exists in one layer and is absent in the next, not because the place vanished, but because the institution altered the words available to describe it. Third, and most straightforward, it would require a technical image, an unambiguous piece of documentation that historic sites routinely produce but do not always release. A current, date-stamped, non-public photograph or survey frame showing the specific junction where the public line stops and the operational logic continues. A technical photo does not interpret. It does not accuse. It simply records a door, a passage, a threshold, a blocked connector, a seam in flooring, a fire-rated barrier, a service access point. With that, the conversation shifts from narrative to geometry. The institution could still choose to keep it off the tour. It would simply no longer be able to keep it out of the record. The action in the present, then, is not exploration by trespass or speculation by rumor. It is procedural inquiry. It is the act of returning to the original map, marking the point where the trace ends and submitting a narrow request for the materials that would resolve whether the omission is interpretive convenience, operational classification, or something else entirely. In an institution like Nemours Estate, such a request is not answered by the building. It is answered by governance, who is permitted to see which version of the plan, who can consult which index terms, who can document which junction, and under what policy. That governance is the reason the case remains suspended. The estate can continue to function, continue to restore, continue to renovate the sunken garden and present a confident narrative to the public while the specific junction remains unclarified, because the institution has no operational need to clarify it publicly. Clarification creates a precedent. Precedent invites further requests. Further requests invite review. Review invites questions about older policy choices, about how interpretation evolved, about why certain vocabulary disappeared, about how preservation became an umbrella term that can cover both care and omission. In the present, the cost of clarification is not physical, it is administrative. Once the institution acknowledges a seam, it inherits the responsibility to explain it or to justify why it will not. That responsibility is precisely what historic sites often avoid, not out of malice, but out of discipline. The safer posture is continuity. Continuity is supported by the official narrative and by the stable visitor experience. The moment continuity is disrupted, the institution must operate in a different mode, transparent enough to satisfy inquiry, controlled enough to avoid spiraling demands. That mode is expensive in time, staff attention, and reputational risk. This is why the investigation, when brought into 2026, does not end with a revelation. It ends with a test of access. If Nemours Estate is willing to provide the narrow documentary lineage, the index consultation, or the technical image, then the question can be closed without drama. If it is not willing, if the request is deferred, redirected, or answered only with generalities, then the case remains open for a reason that has nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with policy. The legacy remains intact. The mansion remains a symbol. The sunken garden can be renewed and photographed and celebrated. The official narrative remains stable enough to repeat. The lacuna persists because stability is governed, and governed stability prefers functional answers over complete ones. The house does not need to deny anything to keep the seam quiet. It only needs to keep the seam outside the scope of what the public is authorized to confirm. And that brings us back to the beginning, in the simplest possible way. In 2026, the most honest representation of the unresolved question is not a theory. It is a marked copy of the visitor map with a small circle drawn at the point where the line stops. attached to a formal access request whose outcome determines whether the archive will be allowed to meet the building. The paper is ordinary. The ink is neat. The response box is still blank. In 1910, Nemours rose as marble and method, an estate designed not only to impress the eye, but to discipline the record. What endures here is not merely the Beaux-Arts symmetry or the cultivated hush of ordered rooms. What endures is the architecture of certainty, the ability to present a house as a finished object, even when its own paperwork suggests a more complicated life. We began with a simple fracture, a public map that did not fully coincide with the house itself, a line that vanished where a working mansion would ordinarily continue. We followed the surviving traces without melodrama. An administrative note that treated access as selective, a document that implied a threshold meant to remain unspoken, a chronology that refused to sit politely inside 1910. And then we watched the institution do what institutions do best: translate discomfort into neutral language, replace explanation with classification, and let repetition become permanence. This is the moral Nemours leaves behind. Aristocracy is not inherited by money alone. It is produced by corridors that separate the seen from the unseen, by inventories that choose what is named, and by governance that decides what may be repeated until it becomes truth. Excess is not only in the stonework, it is in the long capacity to turn a private residence into a stable public narrative, sustained for decades by the careful management of access. Somewhere on the grounds, the sunken garden can be renewed and photographed as preservation. Somewhere inside, a corridor can remain operational while becoming linguistically invisible. The public receives coherence, the archive retains seams, and between them stands the quiet power of an institution that does not need to erase facts to control what facts can mean. So, as the lights dim in these halls, the question is no longer whether Nemours contains a missing passage. The question is what it means when the record itself is treated as part of the architecture, when the file becomes a locked door and the locked door becomes policy. If you intend to remain with us as these sealed histories are approached with patience rather than spectacle, subscribe so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. If this investigation resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And leave your thoughts below, whether it was the map, the document, the chronology, or the softened language of preservation that felt most revealing to you. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And if you are willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Another estate, another ledger, another silence arranged to look like permanence. For in places like Nemours, secrets rarely survive by accident. They survive because those who feared them built systems strong enough to outlast the truth.